You are looking at an unfinished basement corner that can feed your family all winter without a single watt of electricity. No canning, no freezing, no grocery store runs. Just two walls, one vent, and one weekend of work. The two vent pipes create a siphon effect that pulls in cold outside air, keeping the temperature at a perfect 32 to 40 degrees while the rest of your basement stays heated. Carrots, potatoes, cabbages stay crisp for months. The old farmer's almanac says it's like having a 6-month supply of vegetables on hand. Here is the full plan, materials list included. For centuries, every homestead had one, and nobody called it a project. It was just the cold room under the stairs. Then we traded a shovel for a smart fridge, and the knowledge vanished. But the physics have not changed. The difference between a cellar that feeds you until June and one that rots everything in 2 weeks comes down to two simple rules. And most people break both before they even pick up a hammer. Those two rules are so basic, your great-grandparents never even wrote them down. Rule number 1. The cold corner must breathe, or the produce suffocates in its own gas. Rule number 2. You only insulate 3 walls, never 4. Let the concrete foundation wall in. Let the earth on the other side of that concrete do its job. Break either rule, and you are building a compost bin, not a root cellar. I met a man in southeastern Ohio named Ellis who broke both. Took him 2 years of watching potatoes turn to mush before he figured out why. Ellis spent his first attempt framing 4 walls with fiberglass bats, sealing every gap with foam, and building the most airtight closet you have ever seen. The temperature held at 60 degrees. Within 3 weeks, the carrots were black, the onions were sprouting, and the entire room smelled like a garbage disposal. He had trapped the ethylene gas inside and insulated away every bit of cooling the foundation wall was trying to give him for free. The concrete wall on the northeast corner sits against soil that stays a steady 50 to 55 degrees year-round. That wall is supposed to be the cooling source. When you cover it with insulation, you cut yourself off from the one thing that makes the system work. Ellis tore it all out, rebuilt it with rigid foam only on the interior walls and ceiling, and added 2 4-inch vent pipes, 1 intake, 1 exhaust, each with a simple damper. The siphon effect that those 2 pipes create is the engine of the entire cellar. Cold outside air falls through the intake. Warm, stale air rises out the exhaust. You control the temperature with a flap, not a thermostat. The next winter, the room held 38 degrees, even on days the basement hit 65. I opened his door in late March, and the carrots still snapped when I bent them. But what Ellis showed me about the single material mistake that rotted 1,000 pounds of produce before his eyes is the reason most people give up after their first attempt. And it has nothing to do with temperature. The thing that rotted 1,000 pounds of food in a perfectly chilled room was a 4-inch strip of pressure-treated lumber sitting directly on the concrete floor. Ellis had framed his walls with standard 2x4 bottom plates, the same way you frame any interior wall in a house. What he did not account for was that basement concrete is never truly dry. It breathes moisture up from the soil beneath it, season after season, year after year. That moisture wicked straight into the wood plate within 6 months. The bottom of his wall was soft. Within a year, it was feeding a colony of mold that spread spores onto every potato, every carrot, every cabbage head he placed inside. He had built a perfect cold room, and then lined the doorway with a rotting welcome mat. The fix is absurdly simple and costs maybe $12. You cut your bottom plate from composite deck board instead of wood, the same material people use for outdoor decking. It never rots, it never wicks moisture, and it will never feed a single spore of mold. That one swap turns a 5-year structure into a 50-year structure. And once Ellis replaced that plate and rehung his door, the smell disappeared in a week and never came back. But fixing the plate only solved the rot. It did not solve the other invisible killer that had been turning his onions to slime while the thermometer sat at a perfect 39 degrees. Humidity. A root cellar is not a refrigerator. A refrigerator pulls moisture out of the air. A root cellar must keep it in. Root vegetables are still alive when you store them. They are respiring, slowly burning. Stored sugars, and they need high humidity to stay turgid and crisp. The target range is 85 to 95% relative humidity. Most basements naturally sit closer to 50 or 60, drop below 70% for more than a few days, and carrots go rubbery, beets shrivel, and potatoes develop black spot. Ellis discovered this when he opened a bin of parsnips in February and found them so limp they bent double without breaking. He had nailed the temperature, killed the mold, and still lost half his crop to dehydration. The fix, again, costs almost nothing. You spread damp sand in the bottom of your storage bins and nestle root vegetables into it like you are tucking them into bed. The sand holds moisture against the skin of the produce and slows transpiration to a crawl. Carrots, beets, turnips, parsnips, rutabagas, all of them will hold firm until late spring packed this way. For cabbages and onions that need air circulation, you hang them from the ceiling in mesh bags so no surface stays wet long enough to rot. And for the room itself, you keep a shallow pan of water on the floor and a damp burlap sack draped over the top shelf. The sack wicks moisture upward, and the evaporation keeps the whole space hovering near 90%. You check it every few days, same as you check the thermometer. A $5 hygrometer is all you need to know exactly where you stand. But here is the piece that most weekend builders miss entirely, and it is the reason Ellis spent 2 years failing before he succeeded. The corner you choose matters more than any material you buy. You do not build a root cellar on the south wall. You do not build it next to the furnace. You build it in the northeast or northwest corner of the basement, where 2 exterior foundation walls meet. That is where the soil outside stays coldest year-round, where the concrete transmits the most cooling, and where you will find the most stable temperature swings between day and night. Pick the wrong corner, and you fight the earth instead of enlisting it. Pick the right corner, and the earth does half your climate control for free. Ellis had stumbled into the right corner by accident on his first attempt, but he had sealed himself off from it. On his rebuild, he stripped the insulation from the exterior walls entirely, leaving the bare concrete exposed to the cellar interior. He insulated only the 2 interior stud walls he built to close off the corner, plus a layer of rigid foam on the ceiling. The concrete became his cooling panel. The earth on the other side became his compressor. Together, they kept the room at 38 degrees, with nothing but 2 4-inch PVC pipes and a damper flap he adjusted by hand. That is the entire system. A corner, 2 walls, 1 door, 2 vents, some foam, some sand, and a pan of water. The complexity is not in the materials. It is in understanding why each piece exists and what happens if you leave it out. And that leads to the question Ellis asked me on my second visit, the one I could not answer until I saw his electric bill and did the math. If this is so simple, why did an entire generation forget how to do it? The answer sits in a single decade, that rewired how America thinks about food. And the number on that electric bill is what I am about to show you. Ellis showed me his power bill from December, the winter before he built the cellar, and the same month, the winter after. Before, with the second refrigerator in the garage and a chest freezer packed with frozen vegetables, he was paying $142 above his baseline. After, with the root cellar handling all his long-term storage and the second fridge unplugged, the surplus dropped to $55, an $87 difference in a single month. Multiply that across a full winter, and you are looking at $500 saved just by storing food in a hole with 2 pipes. But the money is not the thing that kept Ellis up at night before he built. It was the week the power went out. An ice storm hit southeastern Ohio in February of 2021. The lines were down for 6 days. Ellis had a generator for the furnace, but the second fridge in the garage was drawing 8 amps continuous. He had to choose between keeping his pipes from freezing and keeping 100 pounds of produce cold. He chose the pipes. By the time the power came back, everything in that fridge had thawed and refrozen into a solid block of inedible mush. He lost an entire winter's supply of garden vegetables in less than a week and realized he had spent years growing food he could not protect from a single storm. That is when he started building. What Ellis stumbled into is a truth that an entire generation of Americans unlearned in a single decade after World War II. Before the war, almost every house in the country had a root cellar or a cold storage room. Builders dug them into hillsides, framed them into basement corners, stacked them from fieldstone. The 1930s Farm Security Administration photographed hundreds of them for the historical record. They were as standard as a kitchen pantry. Then the 1950s arrived with cheap electricity, mass-produced refrigerators, and a cultural conviction that anything old was backward. Suburban developers stopped designing basements with cold storage. Home economics textbooks replaced root cellar instructions with freezer stocking charts. The word root cellar itself began to sound like something from a pioneer museum. Within 20 years, a skill that had been universal for millennia became something only grandparents remembered how to do. By the time Ellis tried to build his, the knowledge had skipped 2 full generations. The tragedy is that the technology did not become obsolete. It became invisible. A refrigerator uses a compressor to pump heat out of an insulated box. It costs money to build, money to buy, and money to run every single day it is plugged in. A root cellar uses the thermal mass of the earth and the physics of natural convection. It costs money to build once, and then it runs for 50 years on nothing but gravity. The average second refrigerator in an American garage consumes around 1,500 kilowatt hours per year. At 14 cents per kilowatt hour, that is $210 annually, just to keep a few bags of carrots and some cabbages cold. 4 years of that, and you have paid for an entire root cellar. The rest is pure savings. But that comparison only works if the grid stays on. And in the last 5 years, the grid has become less reliable, not more. Winter storms knock out power for days. Summer heat waves trigger rolling blackouts. Every time the lights flicker, the food in your refrigerator is one compressor failure away from a dumpster. Ellis understood this in his bones after that ice storm. A root cellar does not care if the power is on. The earth does not bill you. Concrete does not crash. The only thing that can ruin your food is your own failure to build it right. And the single most common failure that wrecked Ellis's first attempt was not the wood plate, or the humidity, or the corner selection. It was the vent, specifically the intake. He had placed his intake pipe too high on the wall, pulling air from the basement instead of from outside. The room never got cold enough because the siphon effect never engaged. A proper intake draws from the outside, ideally through an existing basement window or a hole cored through the rim joist. The pipe drops to floor level inside the cellar. The exhaust rises from the ceiling on the opposite wall and vents outside as well. When cold outside air falls through the intake, it displaces warm air that rises and escapes through the exhaust. That continuous loop is what keeps the room at 32 to 40 degrees, even when the rest of the basement is warm. But if either pipe is undersized, if the intake is blocked by a snowdrift, if the dampers stick closed, the entire system fails silently while your vegetables rot. That vent design, the exact diameter, the precise placement, and the one mistake that can freeze your pipes in January, if you ignore it, is where the full build plan begins. Both vents are 4-inch PVC. Nothing fancy. The intake starts outside through an existing basement window or a 4-inch hole cored through the rim joist. It drops straight down to within 2 inches of the cellar floor. The exhaust mounts through the ceiling on the opposite wall and runs outside through the same band joist as far from the intake as you can get it. The siphon triggers automatically the moment the outside air temperature drops below the cellar temperature. Cold, heavy air falls through the intake, pushes warm air up and out the exhaust. No fan, no motor, just physics. A simple damper flap on each pipe lets you throttle the flow. When the outside temperature plunges below zero, you close the dampers most of the way to keep the room from freezing solid. The one mistake that can freeze your basement pipes in January is leaving that intake fully open during a deep cold snap with no temperature buffer. The floor of the cellar can drop to 28 degrees, while the rest of the basement stays 60. That is why you keep a maximum thermometer on the wall and check it every morning. If the cellar approaches 32 degrees, you close the intake damper halfway. The thermal mass of the stored vegetables and the damp sand will hold the room above freezing for days, with very little ventilation. That is the whole climate control system. A corner, 2 stud walls with rigid foam, a composite bottom plate, 1 door, 2 4-inch PVC pipes, 2 dampers, a thermometer, a hygrometer, and a pan of water. The total materials cost for Ellis's build came to just under $300. He framed the 2 interior walls with standard 2x4s on 16-inch centers. He sheathed the inside with 1/2-inch plywood rather than drywall because drywall wicks moisture and crumbles. The insulation went on the outside face of those stud walls facing the warm basement and on the ceiling above. The 2 exterior foundation walls stayed bare concrete, exposed to the cellar air so they could transmit the cooling from the earth. The door is a solid exterior grade door with weather stripping to keep basement heat from leaking in. The shelves are slatted wood, spaced so air can circulate under every crate. Potatoes go in burlap bags inside, slatted bins to block light and prevent greening. Carrots and beets and parsnips get tucked into totes filled with damp builder's sand, layer by layer, so no 2 vegetables touch. Cabbages hang from the ceiling joists in mesh onion bags with their root stems still attached. Onions hang the same way on a separate wall, because onions and cabbages release different gases and will spoil each other if stored together. Apples go nowhere near any of it. A single apple in a root cellar will release enough ethylene to trigger sprouting in 100 pounds of potatoes. Ellis learned that the hard way when he stored a bushel of gallus next to his spuds and turned his entire potato bin into a forest of pale shoots in under 3 weeks. Separate rooms, separate vents, or just keep the fruit out entirely. By February of his third winter, his cellar was dialed in. He was pulling carrots that snapped like fresh cucumbers, potatoes firm as the day they went in, cabbages so crisp the outer leaves crackled when you peeled them. His power bill had dropped permanently. He had not set foot in a grocery produce aisle in 4 months. He was harvesting food he had grown in July and eating it in January without a single watt of electricity in between. That is what a basement corner can do. And the part nobody tells you is that vegetables actually improve in a proper root cellar. The starches in potatoes slowly convert to sugar at near freezing temperatures, giving them a sweeter, creamier texture when roasted. Carrots concentrate their natural sugars, becoming almost candy sweet by late winter. A refrigerator cannot replicate this because its compressor strips moisture, and its temperature cycles above and below the sweet spot. The earth does not cycle. The earth holds steady, and so does your food. The only thing more surprising than what Ellis gained was what he almost lost on a morning in February, when he opened the cellar door and found an inch of water standing on the floor, and the source was something he had never even considered. The source was condensation. A hairline gap above the door frame had let warm basement air bleed into the cold room all night. It condensed on the ceiling, dripped onto the shelves, and pooled an inch deep before Ellis found it. He sealed the gap with a $3 tube of caulk, added a door sweep, and never saw standing water again. That morning, standing ankle deep in a puddle with a flashlight, he almost walked away from the whole project. He told me later it was the best thing that ever happened to his cellar because it forced him to understand every single molecule of air moving through that space. By the following autumn, the room ran so perfectly that he could close the door in October and not open it again until late April except to pull out dinner. What Ellis built is not a storage unit. It is a quiet refusal of a system that tells you food comes from stores, that cold comes from compressors, that you are helpless without the grid. A basement corner, 2 walls, 1 vent, 1 weekend. The only thing standing between you and a winter of food is the decision to start. If this made sense to you, hit subscribe and like this video. And if you are the kind of person who believes real knowledge has been quietly pushed aside, there is a special offer for you through the link in the first pinned comment.